Hi, everybody. This is the lecture for CUAIND202, Develop and Apply Knowledge of Information and Cultural Service Organizations. As you can see on here, I truncated it to I&CSO, and I may just say organizations in the lecture, but we are talking about both information and cultural service organizations. So as you know, we started this term with BSB INS 301, which was about information literacy. And next we went to BSB Tech 201, which was about using business software. Now in CUA IND 202, we're going to jumpstart more of our information on library sciences and figure out where libraries fit into the structure of organizations, of service organizations in our communities. So what are we going to learn in this section, in this unit? This will give you the skills and knowledge to source, update, and maintain knowledge of these organizations. And specifically in the workbook, we're going to learn how to source, collect, and maintain information on information and cultural service organizations, as well as how to use the information we find to seek employment in one of these organizations. So there are three topics in this unit. The first one is source and collect information. The second one is maintain industry information. And the third is seek employment in information and cultural service organizations. Topic one, source, collect, store, and organize information. So the different parts of this section include all these different verbs, all these different actions. We're going to locate different information on these cultural services. We're going to identify the key information about them. We're going to collect the information about them, including the roles and key services provided by each of them. We're going to organize our collected information. We're going to figure out how to store and update the collected information in an easily accessible and retrievable format. And then finally, we're going to seek feedback on the information gathering process and note areas of future improvement. So information and cultural service organizations provide information and cultural service to communities in which we live, to the wider state, or even to Australia as a nation. And so when we look at the words used to describe these organizations, there's both in the information side, and then there's cultural service. And you'll see how the different locations that we talk about fit into each part of either information and or cultural services. So what are the different types of services that we're talking about? We're talking about libraries, of course, but we're also talking about archives. We're talking about libraries, including but not limited to business, law, medical, national and state, public or private, or educational libraries. Then we talk about museums and art galleries. There's a new trend in government agencies right now where they have co-located local government services, meaning that multiple services are located in one area for joint use by members of the public. We'll talk about cultural centers, records and information management services, as well as resource centers. One of the words that comes about in library studies and in archives, museums, and such is GLAM, G-L-A-M, stands for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And for instance, at the University of Newcastle, they have a GLAM department, and they focus most on digitizing records and historical aspects of what the university has. And so that's just a separate note of something that a lot of these groups come together and have created kind of this new acronym for them. So where does the information that we get about these services, where does the information come from? So there can be electronic and print media. There can be employer or employee associations. There can be industry and professional associations. So for instance, for libraries, we have the Australian Library and Information Association. That would be considered a professional association. We have events such as conferences, exhibits, trade fairs, or training sessions. Publications, ALIA, like I was just talking about, of Australian Library and Information Association, has its own publications and its own websites. Then we have libraries and archives. Information can come from libraries and archives about the organizations, government bodies, online social media. So online social media is a relatively new trend the last 5 to 10 years, where all of these government bodies are starting, and social organizations, cultural organizations are starting to use social media to provide information to people in the community. Then we have policy and procedure manuals and union representatives and different sources of industrial relations information. So as I've said in some of the lectures before, sometimes in the workbooks, there are what I call random announcements, and this happens to be one of the random announcements. Adhering to required timeframes. In the book, it talks about that when you're working at any kind of an organization, it's important to know your deadlines and timeframes. And if for any reason you're unable to deliver by the agreed upon deadline, make sure to communicate that with your supervisor in advance. So moving on to what's next. So as you can see here in the top line, there are our GLAM organizations, right? Our galleries, our libraries, our archives, and our museums, even though they're in a different order. And then on the bottom, we have community and information agencies and commercial information agencies. And we're going to learn about what each of these does and the services they provide. So the first key organization is the library. And as we've talked about before, most of the information that's in this slideshow is going to come directly from the workbook. So if you ever need to reference it or read it again, you'll be able to find it there. Libraries are valued for their ability to hold, organize, and disseminate large amounts of information to meet the needs of many different kinds of customers and stakeholders. What does the library do? Provide communities with access to resources, reserve, restore, and maintain important archival material, improve the quality of learning and education within the community, and provide communities with the ability to come together to learn and connect on shared interests. Now, one of the questions that comes up often, and this is definitely something that you will be asked when working in the library field, is, do we need libraries anymore? Everything is online. Well, as some of you know, not everybody is online, first of all. Secondly, as librarians, we have always been the gatekeepers of information. So we help people find information. And even as we move into newer technology, for instance, with artificial intelligence, AI, people may be able to get the information from AI quicker than they can themselves, but are they able to ask the right questions? So our role might change in terms of, instead of doing the searches ourselves and providing the information, we may be teaching people how to ask the right questions. But we always have and always will provide customers with the best way to find and use ethically the information that they find. So I'm just going to start this slide again so that it's really a logical transition point. Okay, so we've talked about what libraries do, and now we're going to talk about the different types of libraries. And we're going to start with national and state libraries. A national library is a library established by a government as a country's preeminent repository of information. Okay, so countries, states, communities have areas that are repositories, which means anything that's published actually gets sent to them. The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. is actually not just a country repository, but it's actually a world repository. They don't accept everything they get, but the libraries are responsible for keeping at least one copy of everything that's published. Now, one of the things that's come up with that recently has to do with the fact that there's a lot of self-publishing, and so they don't necessarily accept items that have been self-published, but anything that's published through one of the publishing companies gets kept. Now, the other thing about Australia is Even though the National Library is the national repository, the state libraries in Australia also act as repositories for published information. So the National Library is not the only location of being a repository for the country. So that brings, and the National Library is in Canberra. So then the state libraries are funded by a state or territory government to provide information services to the public and public libraries. State libraries in Australia have extensive reference collections that have been built up over many years. State libraries play a number of key roles, including developing and supporting public libraries, which can extend to the provisions of multicultural language resources, as well as establishing electronic networks with public libraries to extend the range of service, and also enabling national interlibrary loans through the statewide network of public libraries. So the difference between the national and the state libraries can vary by country, but our State Library of New South Wales is located in Sydney. The interesting thing about the state library is they do absolutely support all of the public libraries. They have an enormous collection and they are a repository, but you can't check anything out from the State Library of New South Wales. You have to request it, they go get it for you, and then you can use it in their reading room. If you do have an opportunity to go visit the State Library, it's remarkable. They even have some exhibits. Both the National and the State Libraries have exhibits. They're stunning, and I highly recommend going to see them. So then we have public libraries. Public libraries are funded by all levels of government and are the responsibility of the local government. They provide information services to all members of the community who live, work, and are educated in the same area, with the aim of serving the information needs of all members of the community. They provide a wide range of library materials and services to meet the information needs of a community. Many of our public libraries are their public library systems are created within LGAs, local government areas. And so, for instance, there are Newcastle libraries up in Newcastle. There are 10 different branches. And then separate from that is the Lake Macquarie libraries, and they have their own branches. Then we have academic and tertiary libraries. So academic and tertiary libraries are usually created to serve the needs of a higher education institution. So the TAFE New South Wales Library is created to provide TAFE students with access to information, space to study, and places to research and interact. The primary purpose of any educational library is to aid the learning, teaching, and research within an institution. With this purpose, academic libraries' main objectives are to provide the information needs of the academic community, reference materials at appropriate levels, create study areas for users, and develop a lending service appropriate to the different types of users. So at our TAFE libraries, they often sometimes they have a fiction section and they have a popular culture section. And then they have books, they specifically order books that support the programs that are being taught at each individual TAFE. So all of the TAFE libraries will not have the same books. They'll have books for whatever is taught at that location. And then one of the things that's going on in all libraries is that they're changing the way that space is being used in libraries. They're doing what's called weeding, taking things out of their collection, decreasing the size of the collection and making more meeting spaces. So you'll particularly see in public libraries that they now have meeting rooms, large tables for people to meet, small cubbies for people to do their own work. They'll also have places where the public can rent out a room or use a room to bring people together. And so in academic libraries, most libraries actually have computers and computer labs where students can do their work, do research, where people can go online, do job hunting or whatever else people want to do on the internet. So then we have archives. So what do we mean by archives? We use the term archives to mean an organization that is responsible for the care and control of archival material, typically public or historical records that are deemed to have enduring value. Records can be accumulated in any media. Okay, so the archives are really the old stuff that people aren't using necessarily, but that we need to keep for its cultural value. So we have in Australia the National Archive, which selects and preserves the most valuable government records and facilitating use by the public. They also promote good records management by Australian government agencies. Okay, so they basically work their main location is in Canberra, and the National Archives specifically focuses on government documents. We have the New South Wales State Archives. So the State Archives and Records Authority of New South Wales is one of Australia's preeminent archives and records authorities, with a vast collection of the historical records and archives dating back centuries. It's their responsibility to develop, preserve, and access New South Wales archives, as well as storing over 650 kilometers of semi-permanent government records for New South Wales public sector offices. So what they mean by 650 kilometers is each shelf that they have, each shelf isn't measured just by the width of the shelf. Let's say it's 1 meter. But if it has 1 meter and it has 8 shelves on it, then it actually is considered 8 meters of shelving. So then if you have 2, it's 16 meters, and 3, it's 24 meters. So it's actually, they talk about linear space when you measure things in libraries and archives. So that's what they're talking about with the 650 kilometers of semi-permanent records. Another example of an archive is the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. They hold the world's largest collection dedicated to Australian and Torres Strait Islander cultures and heritages. One of the things that we learn in library studies is where is the best place to look? Where is the first place to look for certain types of information? So this is a really good one to keep in mind, because if you have a customer who comes in and asks, I'm looking for information about culture and heritage, then you might want to go here first and search their records before you start searching the other libraries who might have very small collections. The Institute is a leader in ethical research and the handling of culturally sensitive material, and holds many unique and irreplaceable items of cultural, historical, and spiritual significance. Their collection has been built through over 50 years of research and is now an excellent source of language and cultural revitalization, native title research, and family and community history. Their role is to foster understanding and recognition of the culture and heritage of First Nations Australia. So now we started with libraries, and then we talked about archives, and now we're talking about museums and art galleries. So the Museums Australia Constitution defines a museum as an institution with the following characteristics. A museum helps people understand the world by using objects and ideas to interpret the past and present and explore the future. A museum preserves and researches collections and makes objects and information accessible in actual and virtual environments. Museums are established in the public interest as permanent, not-for-profit organizations that contribute long-term values to communities. And I think it's really interesting that here they included the fact that there were physical and digital objects, especially because now there's this whole new trend, I would say, in the last 5 years of curating complete digital displays. Like if you had seen that in Sydney, there was the Van Gogh display, and I just saw that there's another one. There are like 3 different ones going around right now. And so it's really neat to see that there's a whole new direction that museums are going with digital displays, where the whole everything that they curate is pulling together these, making them life size, making them bigger than life. It's really interesting. So museums and art galleries have a lot of different names. There can be a natural museum, there can be institutions, science centers, or cultural centers. So they all fit into the same category, even though they have very different kinds of collections. So then we talk about community information agencies. And what we talked about, what I mentioned in the beginning is that there are two different kinds of community information agencies. One category is public, the other category is private. And so here what we're talking about is public information agencies that provide information to meet the everyday needs of people in the community across various sectors, each with different roles. Community agencies deal with two levels of information, and you can see that I've separated the levels into the first level and the second level. And the first level is what people need to survive. Okay, so housing, income, health, law, human rights, and employment are all in the first level. Then we have level 2, which is local information, which is not what you need for survival, but rather the other parts of what you're living and doing in your community. So recreation, education, local events, and community developments. There's an example is the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Services, which is an incorporated Aboriginal organization initiated and based in local communities. It recognizes the role of family and community and the role that they play in physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. They deliver a holistic, comprehensive, and culturally appropriate health service to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And just for your information, there are 144 organizations that operate in over 300 clinics across Australia and are initiated and operated by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. There's another community information organization that a lot of people don't know about, which is good to know, and it's called Beyond Blue. This is a community health agency that extends to mental health. Beyond Blue is an information agency that provides information and support to everyone in Australia for them to help them achieve the best possible mental health at any age, regardless of the location. Beyond Blue provides facts about mental health and people and places to go in order to get support. So sometimes we're going to meet people who may be looking for information about agencies like these, or we may be able to make recommendations about agencies if it's appropriate. But just so that we know agencies like these are around and available, you can also see from something like this what types of agencies you can do research on for your report that you're going to do. Then that whole grouping of agencies were the public agencies or information organizations. Now we're talking about commercial information agencies. So an increasing number of private operation services, there are an increasing number of private agencies which operate information services for profit. What happens is that whatever the agency is or the organization or people in the group or the community don't have time to do the research themselves. So what they can do is they can hire organizations, outside organizations. They can pay them to actually do whatever kind of searching or research that they need, that the organization or business might need. And so here are two examples, Nielsen and Information Edge, which is basically providing business solutions through providing information. So now that we've talked about all of those different types of organizations, and you can see where libraries fit within all of those organizations. Now what we're going to do is talk about key roles in each of those organizations. So the first one is libraries, and our main roles that we have in libraries are librarians and information specialists, library technicians, and library assistants. So just so you know, the Cert 3 that you're in school for right now, as well as any other education that you have, qualifies you to work as a library assistant. In order to become a library technician in Australia, you actually need to have your diploma of library and information studies, which comes after the Cert 3. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in studying and interested in continuing, the diploma is an excellent opportunity that comes next. Then if you go beyond that in Australia with either a bachelor or a master's degree in library and information studies, that's the point at which you can become a librarian. And library technicians and librarians are the two levels of library professionals who are recognized in ALIA, who become members of the professional organization. But I do highly recommend that all of you start going on your job boards, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later in the slideshow. I recommend that you go on and try to look for jobs now. Start applying for jobs now, because getting your foot in the door is probably the hardest part in terms of getting a library job. So what about in archives? What are some of the roles in archives? Two of the biggest role in archives is the archivist, the person who takes care of the archives. They're information service professionals who collect, preserve, store, and provide access to records deemed to have long-term value. And what they do is they actually look at all of the different letters, written records, photographs, audio recordings, and they actually create metadata or digital information about those items and possibly scan it, put it into the computer. They're the ones who take care of the different documents in an archive. So what does the archivist typically do? They collect the information and they assess the long-term value of those records. They look after it and preserve it. They apply a knowledge of legal responsibility. And we talk about copyright and confidentiality, but they're the ones who are responsible for making sure that whatever system is being used with those records, that they're appropriately being used and that copyright isn't being broken. They arrange and describe the archives for management, control, and access. So they're the ones who are creating what I called metadata, which is where they give it a number, they describe what it is, they tell the computer where it is, so that if you're searching for something, you can actually find the information. They provide services to people wishing to use the archives. And they understand the evolution of records and archives, for example, using new technologies. So they look at what they can do as an organization to stay current and making sure that everything in the archive continues to be accessible to people who need to use it. So what are two of the main roles in museums and art galleries? Our two main roles in art museums and art galleries are curators and museum technicians. So I talk a lot about in libraries, I talk about us creating LibGuides or library guides or subject guides. And I talk about us being curators of library information by topic that we share with people. Well, this is where in museums, they are curators. They basically pull together, they create exhibits with like information and create some kind of a presentation based on something on a topic, whatever that topic could be. It could be maps, it could be magic, it could be cruising through the South Pacific, whatever it is, they're going to pull together all the different art that they have about that artist. They may also borrow art from other museums. Recently in Sydney, they had the Matisse exhibit. And so they probably may not be their exhibit, but they might borrow it from other people. And the curator would be the one responsible for actually displaying everything and figuring out how it all fits into the room or rooms of the exhibit. Then the museum technicians are responsible for restoring, maintaining, and preparing the artifacts in the museum or gallery for exhibition. So they're going to take care of all the artifacts. So what are some of the roles that we have in our community information agencies? I'm sure that you've all had interaction with customer service officers or coordinators. And customer services officers are the ones who help people get information and get things done. And then the coordinators are the ones who are supervising teams and coordinating the delivery of whatever service is involved at that organization. So let's talk, what this information is actually directly from your workbook. And I'm not going to actually go through each of these definitions, but I did feel like it was beneficial to note that the definitions are here. I have, I think, 3 slides on them. And note that they're really good. It's a very good, valuable list of definitions. And so information seeking is understanding the information need, but then researching, located, and selecting. So it's not just looking, it has all these different parts, okay? And then if you see in these slides as we continue going through them, I would just spend time looking through these and figuring out how they fit in. Read through this part of the book and see how these vocabulary words all fit into your overall knowledge. And one of the things people always ask when they're learning, and you guys just finished information literacy, what is information literacy education? Understanding the importance of information literacy in the community and facilitating the development of information literacy skills. And lifelong learning was in there. That's one of my favorite concepts, is on the slide before. Having a commitment to continuous learning and self-improvement. And so those are all really good things to keep to spend some time on and read through in the workbook. They're going to be very helpful to you. Now let's talk about generic skills and attributes. So what are the different skills that you need to be a part of a library team? And so I would say, number one, effective communication skills. Number two, professional ethical standards and social responsibility. When you talk about professional ethical standards and social responsibility, you need to understand your community. You almost always, the answers to a lot of the questions are follow the policies and organizational procedures. Okay, so you need to be able to work in a professional environment and align with their procedures. Customer service. You should have critical, reflective, and creative thinking. And we're actually going to talk about some reflective thinking later in this slide. Problem-solving skills, an ability to build partnerships and alliances, as well as working as a part of a team. So when we collect information about these organizations, this is just one example of a table on how do we collect it so that we can use the information that we're finding. So you're going to be asked to look at an organization and to look at what we've just gone through in the slideshow. But you can see here on this table here, it has all the different types of organizations on the left-hand side. Then it asks, what is the role of the organization? The key service that it provides, the personnel involved, skills and knowledge required to fulfill each role, and examples of partnerships. So what we're trying to learn how to do is handle large amounts of information and put it into a table so that we can read all of it and understand how the information relates to itself. Okay, and you want to use a usable format. And so what we've talked about, for instance, the role of if we look at the public library and we say the role of the organization, the role is to provide information, access to resources, and a place for the community to come together. And then what key services? We have computer services, we have research services, we have meeting place services that we offer to people. Who's involved? We talked about the three different kinds of people who are involved. We talked the different people who are, there are other people. You might have an IT person at a library. You may also have janitorial staff at a library. But who are the main people who have the roles in the library? I'm moving over, by the way, from the left columns over through these each for the, in this particular row of public library. Then what skills and knowledge are required to fulfill each role, and examples of partnerships. When we talk about partnerships, we talk about who can the library work with in order to become a more useful institution. So for instance, if it was a public library, you would say, well, maybe we want to partner with a cafe, because we want people to come and we want people to hang out. We want them to have a cuppa and read a book. Okay, so maybe you would say a cafe, but if it was a university library, you would probably also say that they would have a cafe. But you might say that they would, if it was a university library near a science institute, you might say, oh, it would be a good idea for the university library to partner with the science institute so that the library can provide a feed directly into the jobs at the Science Institute, but also maybe some of the people who work at the Science Institute become teachers in the university. And so that's what that final column is all about. Okay. We're switching gears and moving on to referencing. So what is referencing and why do we do it? So when researching and considering the ideas of different people, it's important to keep track of the sources of your information and reference correctly to ensure you don't plagiarize content. So what does plagiarize mean? Plagiarism is using someone else's thoughts, words, or ideas and writing them as if they were your own. It's technically stealing. So when you write papers or when you use ideas, like I've told you about this PowerPoint presentation, everything that's in here is from the workbook. It's directly from the workbook. I didn't make anything up that's in this PowerPoint presentation. I didn't create these words. This is directly from the workbook that TAFE offers. If there was anything in here that I borrowed, let's say a YouTube video, or let's say a picture, if I add anything to the presentation and I take it from the internet or found it in a book to add, I would have to put referencing information there and say, acknowledge that somebody else created it, not me. When you put information into a paper or another document, there are two ways to do it. You can do a direct quote where you do a quotation marks and you write verbatim exactly what the person wrote. Or you can even read what somebody has written and rewrite the whole thing. Like what I'm talking about right now with plagiarism is me rewriting, I'm re-speaking what I learned about plagiarism from the slide. It's still not my own idea. The idea is still from the workbook, so I still need to give credit to the workbook. So even when you paraphrase, you have to give credit where credit is due. And library professionals, one of our jobs is making sure that people in the whole information literacy scheme, we start by finding out what the information need is. We do our research. We decide whether the research we have is good for our project. Then we use it in our project, but we also have to do that next step, which is using it ethically. And so it's really important, plagiarism, knowing what plagiarism is, knowing how to ethically use the information is one of the things that we are responsible for teaching to the whole world. That's one of the things librarians do. So it says the rule of thumb is anything that you have reviewed or heard that has influenced your writing needs to be referenced. And it could extend to a concept or idea, paraphrased information, or even a direct quote. Okay, so anything that we use that is from somebody else's idea, we need to give them credit for. So I made a change from the workbook on page 25 because it talks about the most popular use of, and it may have said MLA, I don't recall right this minute what it was, but I'm changing this to say that the preferred approach in library and information studies is APA, the American Psychological Association. It's important that you understand, I think it said Chicago actually, there are different formats for writing papers, and there are different formats for giving credit. You're doing the same thing no matter what format you're using. Those formats those are what we're calling APA, Harvard, Chicago, okay? The type of referencing that we're doing is called author date format, where we start our reference with an author and then do a comma and then put the date. There are also what are called footnote or formats, numerical formats, where you simply just add a number to it, no matter where it, based on when it appears in your paper. Those are a very different format than what we use in the social sciences. At TAFE in particular, they have guides on the APA style and Harvard style. Those are the two styles that the students at TAFE use most of the time. And the biggest referencing tip I can give you is as soon as you pick up any article or any book and you find one piece of information from it that's valuable, add it to your list. You're better off adding it to your list in the beginning than trying to figure out where you got information from before. Nowadays, you can keep digital folders when you're doing research. You can research a lot of books and articles and put them in your TAFE digital folder, and it'll all be there for you, which is really nice. So how do we store information? So one of the questions you're going to be asked is, how does your cultural service organization use and store information? How do they how do they disseminate information to the people? What access do the customers have to information, and how do they get that information? So you have to see, first of all, as we've said many times, you always want to align with the policies and procedures of the organization. But we ask, how do you create, store, access, retrieve, use, update, and retain and dispose of collected information? It's really important that there are policies that guide any organization. One of the things that doesn't come up very often, but actually libraries participate all the time, usually on an ongoing basis, is the weeding process. How do you dispose of items? When do you dispose of them? Do you only dispose of items that aren't in good enough shape to keep? Or because you need more floor space, do you actually look at your entire collection and say, anything that hasn't been checked out in 10 years, we're going to remove that from our collection and put it somewhere else, or give it to somebody else. Sometimes it's not appropriate to keep all of the collection. And so the organizational policies and procedures should give you a guideline as to how to use the information that is accessible to you. So where do we store all this information? We need to know where information is stored and what kinds of information we're storing. So Liberty SoftLink is our ILMS, our integrated library management system. By the way, you will hear the term ILMS and LMS. They are the same thing. Integrated library management system and library management system. Liberty is an example of a library management system that we use in our program. Some information is in email applications. Some information is stored in shared drives. We have our OneDrive, and the nice thing about the OneDrive is that we can actually share files with other people. Dropbox or some other third-party cloud storage. Some information is kept in physical filing cabinets. There are other applications where you can keep, where you can store information. It can be stored as hard copies, which can be either bound or loose leaf. Then you can have so many electronic records, right? You can have disks, thumb drives, microfilm, or cloud-based storage solutions. It seems like electronic records are the biggest challenge of organizations today. So this is the last part of our slideshow, and it talks about seeking feedback. Actually, it might not be the last part, but we're going to seek feedback at this point. So we look at the nature of how we use and disseminate information, and it has changed dramatically with the explosion of information in the internet. So it's crucial that we evaluate the information we're collecting, storing, and sharing. And we seek feedback to determine its relevance and significance. Are we collecting the right type of information for this organization? The other reason for seeking feedback is to connect relevant people who should be providing input into the information you're using. You want to make sure that if you're in a locality, let's say you're at a university, you want to get feedback from the professors as to whether the library has the correct resources that the students in their classes need. Okay, for instance, if you were a public library or a school library, you want to make sure, you want to talk to the teachers, find out what the kids are talking about, which new books should you be purchasing on behalf of the students. You want to get feedback from the people around to make sure you have the best information in your collection. So this again is another random announcement. We're talking about the 7 C's of effective communication. So in feedback, you want to try to both ask the questions and answer the questions with all of these excellent C's of effective communication. You want to be clear, concise, concrete, correct, coherent, complete, and courteous. And as we move on to talking about where you look for information on jobs, as you're applying for jobs, you want to think about these 7 C's of effective communication and how you can integrate them into what the activities that you're doing. So let me make sure that I shared this correctly. Can you hear that? Yeah. All right. Now let's get back into the slideshow. There we go. So all of that was topic 1. Now we have 2 more topics to go. So maintaining industry information. You want to make sure that you review industry information on an ongoing basis to ensure your currency. You want to pay attention to trends and emerging technologies and how those relate to the work that you're doing. You want to identify different industries with which it's appropriate for you to have relationships with. So for instance, ALIA might have a relationship with the American Library Association, and they both might have a relationship with IFLA, which is an international organization. And then you can also share information on volunteer opportunities in all of these different organizations. So let's talk about ALIA. I've mentioned it a couple times. This is the National Professional Organization for Australian Library and Information Services. In their words, they seek to empower the profession through the development, promotion, and delivery of quality library and information services. They offer, so they do, this is actually a really important issue of librarianship in general. And that is that it's an integral part of librarianship is the promotion of the free flow of information and ideas, as well as improving services provided by library and information professionals, service professionals. There's a lot going on in the United States right now with banning of books. And in the history, there's been burning of books and banning books. And librarians pretty overwhelmingly and overarchingly absolutely support the free flow of information. ALIA has both a professional journal and a magazine, and Insight magazine is the magazine that they publish quarterly. They also have regular events and programs which industry professionals are provided with opportunities to network and learn from other industry experts. So here are some examples of other organizations, other professional organizations in the GLAM departments. So we have the Records and Information Management Professionals, Australian Society of Archivists, Australian Museum and Galleries Association. And then, of course, this one isn't the GLAM sector, but the other information agencies, which is Community Information and Support Victoria. So what are some of the trends and emerging technologies that are going on in these arenas? We have a lot of e-resources. One of the biggest, huge shifts is all surrounded by e-resources and how that affects everything. It doesn't just affect the fact that that people are using computers more and that librarians are teaching people about computers, but also that the collections are getting smaller. The floor space is being used differently. People are coming in for more community reasons. There are just a lot of different ways that e-resources and electronics and computers are affecting all of these organizations. Mobile apps, social media, different file formats for storage. So now everybody isn't storing on their own computers, but rather they're storing online, in the cloud online. RFIS, it says, which I think is supposed to be RFID, which is a technology with barcodes so that items they don't even have to be scanned as they just go through a doorway, then we know that they've left the room. Syndetics, digital interactive resources, virtual service delivery, online. Virtual service delivery, online teaching and learning, you are all involved in it right now. So whether you're online listening right now or you are watching this video somewhere else, this is all happening digitally. And COVID forced a lot of that on us. Robots, there are actually robots who can go and find resources and bring them back. Robots who can shelve resources. There's a robot there was this one really, really long library, and they found that the librarians and library technicians were spending too much time walking from end to end of the library. So they got a robot that somebody on one end, the place where people return books is on one end, and then the processing section's on the other end of the library. So they have a robot that actually takes the books back and just constantly is taking back, all day long, it's just taking books back to the circulation department. Co-locations, I talked about that a little bit earlier, where there are multiple organizations in one location. The other thing that's happening is that some of the city services are transferring to the libraries. An example of when that happens is dog licenses, for instance. A dog license is really just a piece of paper, and once somebody fills out the piece of paper, it just needs to be paid for and then accepted by somebody. And so they're finding that instead of because people have different needs of hours that they're open. For instance, the libraries are often open on Saturdays, that they'll have a service like that that's pretty easy in the libraries. Since the librarians and library technicians and assistants are there anyway, they can put the money into keeping the library open for everybody and offer those services in the same spot. And then community partnerships and alliances are happening a lot. And then we have new technologies with data and how data is managed, stored, cared for, and disseminated are all trends in emerging technologies. When we talk about relationships with different industries, we talked about that a little bit earlier, but you might consider the education industry or publishing and mass media industries when you talk about the types of partnerships that would be beneficial for any one of these organizations. And also within GLAM, a library, actually, I just heard a rumor that in Newcastle, the museums and the libraries are going to be joining forces in some aspect, maybe not everything, but maybe in terms of staffing and hours of operation and things like that, that those two, and like doing their budgets and things like that, the libraries and the museums are coming together. So those are other things to think about when you talk about relationships with other industries. And then, of course, we mentioned before that you can share information about volunteer opportunities. When you volunteer in an organization, you have an opportunity to learn a lot about it. So it's actually a good way to get into an organization to start is go and volunteer at your local library, volunteer in your school library. I know that a couple of you are already volunteering in your school libraries. And then if you want to look into volunteering more, you can volunteer in New South Wales. And here is a video of that.
Why be a volunteer? Because volunteers make a difference and can change lives. Plus, you meet new people, learn new skills, take on a challenge, have fun, and most importantly, make a difference. Who are volunteers? They come from all backgrounds. Volunteers are working people students, professionals, young people, and retirees. What can you do as a volunteer? There is something for everyone, and there are many ways you can help others. From volunteering in sport, emergency services, teaching, food and hospitality, helping people with disabilities, and giving animals a second chance to feel loved. What's certain is that you are sure to find something that's right for you. You'll feel rewarded and you'll be valued. Volunteers make a real difference in their communities and to the lives of the people around them. And we want you to know, so can you. To find the perfect volunteering opportunity near you, visit www.makeadifference.volunteering.nsw.gov.au.
So you have an opportunity to volunteer at a lot of different places in our communities. Museums and heritage places usually have volunteer programs. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's communities, State Library of New South Wales, they have an opportunity to become a volunteer. You can become a volunteer at the National Library of Australia, the National Archives, the Australian Museum, and Art Galleries of New South Wales. So keep it in mind as something, even if you get started right away and volunteer 1 hour a week or something like that, some may even have opportunities to volunteer digitally. You never know. So we also, as we talk about information and cultural service organizations, what do we do with that information? Well, one of the things that we do is we share the information with our colleagues. Okay, again, this is the third random announcement of this unit. Volunteering gives you the opportunity to practice and develop your social skills by meeting people who share common interests. And when you share that information and those opportunities with your colleagues, it can help promote a culture of openness and learning in the workplace. And now we move on to the third and final part of this video. This is a long one. It's probably one of the longer ones that we've had. And this is, how do we seek employment in information and cultural service organizations? So in this topic, we're going to talk about locating key information on employment opportunities in these organizations and applying information and new insights to a job when seeking employment opportunities. So you need to locate key information. And the first part of this conversation has to do with the fact that your career is your responsibility. So you need to create your own plan for short-term and the long-term. And as with any plan, you need to clarify and identify and prioritize your goals. You need to consider what can help you and what can hinder you. Okay. Remember, you can list the support of colleagues, and that this process is your responsibility. So you have to ask yourself, there are key questions to ask yourself when you're thinking about whether this is the right field for you. What career do I really want? Am I choosing a career that I know I'd be good at, or one that I really want? Is there a likelihood of getting a job in my chosen career? Or will my skills be transferable if I decide to move into a different industry? One of the great things I think that is about library studies in general is that we have people who come from all different backgrounds to library studies, and then we have people who take what they learn in library studies and use them in many other fields. So when you talk about information literacy, research, learning how to do research, learning how to validate resources, those are excellent skills that you can transfer to any other industry that you choose to go into. So in terms of getting jobs, we just want you to be open-minded about opportunities, be realistic. All your work experience is valid, even if you don't think it's valid. And it's interesting because recently, one of my students applied for a job and it needed to have customer service. She didn't have any customer service. Well, another student who was applying for a job said, oh, I've only worked at Macca's. How is working at Macca's going to be valuable in my application to a library? Okay, the customer service component of it was the following instructions, was a part of the process. Being able to be within a hierarchy and work with team members is part of the process. So no matter where your job is, no matter what your role is, no matter what work experience you have, it's valid and can be included in when you represent yourself while searching for jobs. But consider the terms and conditions of each employment opportunity as they come up. So there are a lot of different jobs that are available in information and cultural service organizations, library services, museum and art galleries, archives. We've kind of gone through all of these, but event management is something people don't think about. Customer service, literacy and literature, education and learning. There are also sales positions. I had a presentation from OCLC and WorldCat this week, and they're looking for the perfect salespeople who have background in computers and libraries. And so there are a lot of different types of jobs that you can go to and look for work in after learning this. So this is a list of places that you could go to look for jobs in your field. And I will, by the way, download this PowerPoint and make it accessible to everybody. I've heard that the best ones are Seek. I work for New South Wales, which doesn't happen to be on this list. I work for New South Wales, as well as the council websites, each individual council website. Okay, so these are some examples of community organizations with job opportunities. When you're looking at jobs, if you don't know this information already, it's good to understand what the description means. So full-time is when you have a fixed number of hours per week. Generally, it's 38 hours. Part-time is somewhere between or less than 38 hours. So it can be any amount of hours less than 38. Casual means that you have employed flexibility. You've been employed flexibly. The hours may change from day to day, week to week, month to month, or semester to semester. Okay. A volunteer is where an individual provides their personal time to help the organization, but it does not get paid any wages in exchange. It's also becoming commonplace for employers to work a combination of hours from home and in the office or at customer-facing locations. So that's a new trend that's going on a lot in job locations. So I talked a little bit before about the different roles in library sciences, and this has to do with the competency standards in libraries itself. Library and information workers are increasingly subject to competency-based assessment in the workplace, in keeping with changes to the National Training Program framework. ALIA requires a diploma in library and information studies in order to work as a library technician, and a bachelor's degree or higher to work as a librarian. And the other, another thing to keep in mind is I happen to be a librarian with a master's in library and information sciences, but you can also become a teacher in the library studies programs at TAFE by you not only get what you can teach one level higher, you have to be one level higher than the level that you're teaching. And so I have a master's degree, so I can teach a bachelor's, diploma, Cert 4, 3, any of those below that. And then that you also, in addition to your library studies, you would have to do a teaching and assessment for 0116, which is a Cert 4 in teaching and assessment. And that's how you get to be a teacher at TAFE in library studies. So there are different phases in the job search process. First, you identify your skills. What can you do? What are you good at? And what jobs will work for you? Now, one of the things, I was at a conference recently and they talked about, and I want you to just keep this in mind for yourself, is you don't necessarily have to know how to use every single computer program and how it works. What you need is what they call digital dexterity, which means that what you can do is you can learn a new program. You don't have to know every LMS, every library management system that exists out there, but you have to know what the LMS does. And then you have to be able to learn a different one if you go into a new job, and let people know that you have that digital dexterity and that you can take on that job, even if you don't know it, that you're interested in learning new things. You apply for jobs, and when you apply for jobs, the first part is the formal application. The application can be submitted online via email or even sometimes by hand or in the mail. And each advertisement will specify what you need to do in order to become an applicant for that job. It's really important. This is really important, and I cannot stress it enough. When you're applying for jobs, it's really important that you follow the instructions. Make sure you meet the selection criteria and that you tell them how you meet the selection criteria. Okay, prepare your groundwork, look at the organization's website, write things into what you write in your cover letter about how you fit into the organization based on the research you've done. And in the written application, there are typically these different items that include. There's usually a covering letter, a response to selection criteria, a resume, and any other application forms or documents. I'd like to tell you something I learned coming into Australia, and I didn't know this, is that when people are looking at your paperwork, they actually want to see your response to selection criteria listed out, like a bullet or a number for each one. And then they want examples of how you have done those things, or how you view those issues, or how you are capable of doing whatever is in the selection criteria. They want specific examples, okay? Then you typically have the interview. Here's one thing that I always tell people: if it's a job you're really passionate about, you should look at, and this could be an American thing, but I always say that if it's a job that you really, really want, that you should tell the person in the interview when it's appropriate, I really want this job. Let them know that this job is a priority for you, and that you are willing to do what it takes to get this job and keep this job. Okay. Do everything you can to prepare a standout application, and make sure that you're prepared for your interview. Okay. You want to make sure, and that includes, by the way, not just knowing about the organization, not just answering the questions that they've already provided you, but also dressing appropriately. Smart formal attire is usually what's appropriate. Present yourself professionally. Remember that it's an interview is an opportunity to make a great impression. I think that there is a huge shift in communication with my generation and people who are younger than me in using swear words in everyday communication. And I would just say, as a general rule, don't swear in an interview. Even if it's your friend who you're interviewing with, and in normal, when you're over at the pub, you guys would swear in your conversation. When you're in the interview, absolutely don't. Be early, be clean. Make sure you don't smell before you get there. Make sure your clothes are ironed. Okay, the better, the early, if you're there a couple minutes early, not only it'll just help the committee, and they'll be happy, and they'll see that you're prompt and on time, and that you take their job seriously. So in conclusion, the 3 topics that we talked about in this really long unit are sourcing and collecting information about information and cultural service organizations, maintaining industry information, and seeking employment in information and cultural service organizations.